The year 1992 stands as one of the most chaotic and self-inflicted disasters in professional wrestling history. WCW cycled through 4 different executive leaders in barely 12 months. They alienated their roster with absurd rule changes that seemed designed to transport wrestling back to the 1970s. They squandered a 5-star War Games match and a historically significant World Championship reign. And they drove away top talent to the competition at the worst possible time. This is the complete story of everything that went wrong with WCW in 1992. A year that proves sometimes your worst enemy is yourself. On January 8, 1992, WCW Executive Vice President Jim Herd was forced to resign after years of mismanagement that had driven Ric Flair to the WWE. Herd was the former Pizza Hut executive who had proposed the Spartacus gimmick for Flair and created disasters like the Ding Dongs and the Black Scorpion. His departure was long overdue. His replacement was Alan Frey, known as Kip Frey. He was a Turner Broadcasting attorney who had represented WCW in legal battles, including the embarrassing situation when Flair debuted on WWE television still wearing the big gold belt. Frey was publicly introduced at Clash of the Champions 18th on January 21, 1992, where he immediately announced that Jesse the Body Ventura had signed as WCW's new color commentator. Though Frey lacked traditional wrestling experience, his initiatives showed genuine promise. His most significant contribution was instituting performance bonuses for wrestlers who delivered the best matches on each card. This policy was designed to incentivize effort rather than allowing performers to phone in their work. The system paid immediate dividends at Super Brawl II on February 29th, where Brian Pillman and Jushin Thunder Liger delivered a 17-minute classic that won the bonus. That match is still considered one of the greatest opening matches in pay-per-view history. Frey also implemented his own steroid policy at a time when the WWE was facing increasing scrutiny over drug use. He maintained the valuable New Japan Pro Wrestling relationship that allowed WCW to bring in talent like Jushin Thunder Liger and the Great Muta. He kept Dusty Rhodes in a booking role which provided creative continuity. And he worked to repair WCW's struggling house show circuit, which had been losing money for years. Super Brawl II on February 29, 1992, showed what WCW could accomplish under competent leadership. Beyond the Pillman vs. Liger opener, the show featured solid matches throughout the card. Sting successfully defended the World Championship against Lex Luger in the main event. The Steiner brothers retained their tag team titles. The show drew a respectable buy rate and received positive reviews. Under Frey's brief leadership, WCW seemed to be stabilizing and moving past the disaster of the Flair controversy. The company had a direction. The talent was motivated by the bonus system. The relationship with New Japan was producing exciting matches. Things were looking up. Yet Frey's tenure lasted barely 4 months. Days after Wrestle War on May 17, 1992, Turner Broadcasting announced that Bill Watts had been hired as the new executive vice president. The exact reasons for Frey's removal remain unclear, but reports suggest Turner management wanted someone with more wrestling experience at the helm. What they got instead was a man who had been out of the business for 5 years and whose philosophy was hopelessly antiquated. William F. Watts came to WCW with an impressive resume. In the 1980s, his Mid-South wrestling territory was considered the best regional promotion in America. It briefly became the #1 rated show on cable television in the weeks leading up to the first WrestleMania. He created the episodic style of wrestling television that emphasized week-to-week storylines. He developed future legends, including Junkyard Dog, Ted DiBiase, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, and Jake the Snake Roberts. Jim Ross got his start under Watts in Mid-South. Even the harshest critics acknowledged that Watts was a genuine wrestling genius. However, after selling his Universal Wrestling Federation to Jim Crockett Promotions in 1987, following severe financial losses caused by the Oklahoma oil economy crash, Watts had been away from the business for 5 years. His 1991 interview with Wade Keller in the Pro Wrestling Torch revealed a man whose ideas about wrestling were frozen in a different era. That interview ironically helped get him the WCW job, but it would also eventually destroy his tenure. Jim Ross admitted his own concerns on the Grilling JR podcast. He said he was a little leery, to be honest. He knew that if Watts got settled in and got in his own lane and created his own way, he could do great things. Ross just wasn't sure what his communication skills were going to be this long, removed from action. Within weeks of taking over, Watts issued a memo to wrestlers containing what became known as the 10 Commandments. These were a series of strict rules that seemed designed to transport WCW back to the 1970s. The restrictions went far beyond normal workplace policies into the realm of paranoid kayfabe enforcement. Babyfaces and heels could not socialize in public. They couldn't travel together. They couldn't take the same flights. Eventually, they couldn't even stay at the same hotels or eat at the same restaurants. Heels' wives and children were banned from attending shows because Watts believed villains shouldn't be seen as loving family men. If a wrestler took a beating on television and was later spotted eating at a restaurant that night, Watts would fire them on the spot. All wrestlers were required to sell their injuries when traveling between shows in case fans saw them in public. Tony Schiavone described the Monday morning meetings with Watts on the What Happened When podcast. He said Watts would bring out his little yellow notepad after watching WCW Saturday Night and just critique everything that he saw. And he would unmercifully hammer. J.R. Ross would sit right there and take it. Schiavone remembered looking at J.R. thinking that J.R. was a bigger man than him, because Schiavone would have walked. There were things Watts said to J.R. that were unbelievable, but J.R. took it. The most infamous of Watts' rule changes was the ban on all moves executed from the top rope. Any move off the top rope became an automatic disqualification. Combined with the existing NWA rule that throwing an opponent over the top rope was also a disqualification. This restriction strangled WCW's emerging cruiserweight division, just as it was producing classic matches. Beach Blast on June 20th, 1992 was the first pay-per-view where these rules were enforced, and the results were immediately disastrous. In the six-man tag featuring Barry Windham, Dustin Rhodes, and Nikita Koloff versus Arn Anderson, Steve Austin, and Bobby Eaton, the match ended anticlimactically via disqualification when Anderson hit a top rope axe handle on Windham after 15 minutes of action. Jim Ross tried to defend the rules on commentary, assuring viewers that critics just don't understand. But the finish perfectly demonstrated why the rule was killing matches. Situations that should have added excitement were instead ending matches in frustration. Watts claimed he was banning the moves to make them seem more special when he would later allow them. The theoretical logic was that heels could pull off such moves behind the referee's back to generate heat and add danger. In practice, the ban primarily hurt wrestlers whose styles depended on aerial offense. Brian Pillman's entire Flying Brian persona was neutered. Bobby Eaton couldn't hit his signature top rope leg drop. Ricky Steamboat had his arsenal limited. Japanese sensation Jushin Thunder Liger was handicapped. The light heavyweight division, which had just produced the Pillman vs. Liger Classic at Super Brawl 2, became unworkable. A tournament for a new light heavyweight champion was announced, but never took place because the rules made the division pointless. Adding further confusion, NWA-sanctioned matches held different rules. Top rope moves and brawling on the floor were allowed in the NWA Tag Team Tournament. This only reminded fans how dumb the off-the-top rope ban was in regular WCW matches. Watts also ordered the removal of protective mats from ringside wherever Athletic Commission rules allowed. This forced wrestlers to bump onto bare concrete. His reasoning was that it would make the wrestlers appear tougher and distinguish WCW from the WWE's product. Those with hip and back problems didn't share his preference for bare concrete. The policy increased injury risk for no discernible benefit. The rules were eventually overturned via a premium rate 900 number phone vote around Clash of the Champions 20 in September. This was a money-making exercise that acknowledged the restrictions had failed while still extracting cash from fans who had to pay to vote against bad ideas. The damage was already done. Months of television and pay-per-view matches had been hamstrung by arbitrary restrictions that made no sense to modern audiences. Wrestlers had been forced to work around limitations that hurt their characters and their match quality. The light heavyweight division that should have been a major selling point for WCW was effectively dead. Bill Watts defended his rules by pointing to how Mid-South had operated in the 1980s. But Mid-South was a regional territory operating in a completely different era. The wrestling business had changed dramatically since then. Fans expected a certain style of match. They expected high spots and dramatic finishes. Telling them that jumping off the top rope was now illegal was like telling basketball fans that dunking was banned. It made no sense and it hurt the product. Before Watts took over, WCW had assembled one of the greatest heel factions in wrestling history. The Dangerous Alliance was formed in November 1991, immediately following Clash of the Champions 17. The group featured an extraordinary collection of talent. Paulie dangerously served as the manager. This was Paul Heyman before he became the genius behind ECW. Ravishing Rick Rude was the centerpiece and held the United States Championship for nearly all of 1992. Rising star Stunning. Steve Austin was years away from becoming Stone Cold, but already showed incredible potential. Veteran Arn Anderson brought legitimacy and ring psychology. Tag specialist Beautiful Bobby Eaton was one of the most underrated workers of his generation. Larry Zbyszko added veteran credibility. And Medusa served as director of covert operations. The faction accumulated championships throughout the spring. Rude held the U.S. title. Anderson and Eaton won the tag team titles. Austin held the television title twice. They feuded with Sting's squadron building toward War Games at Wrestle War on May 17, 1992 in Jacksonville, Florida. That match was so good that Dave Meltzer awarded it 5 stars. It was his last such rating for a WCW match. The 23-minute bout featured Barry Windham biting open Steve Austin's wound. Medusa climbed the cage to slide Paul E's giant cellular phone inside as a weapon. The finish came when Zbyszko accidentally hit Bobby Eaton with a turnbuckle connector, allowing Sting to force the submission. Steve Austin later reflected that it was the wildest damn thing he had ever been in. The match remains universally considered the greatest War Games in history. It had outstanding pacing, constant chaos, gallons of blood, and Jim Ross's superb commentary. And then Bill Watts took over days later and proceeded to let the angle fall apart. Arn Anderson's assessment was blunt. He said the Dangerous Alliance never became a memorable group because of WCW's incompetent bookers failing to promote stars. The Dangerous Alliance never had a world champion as its figurehead. This was a critical difference from the Four Horsemen who had Ric Flair. After the War Games loss, Zbyszko was expelled from the group and the faction began splintering. By Beach Blast in June, Rude and Medusa felt separated pursuing their own Steamboat program, while Anderson, Eaton, and Austin lost their 6-man tag. The killing blow came from Watts himself. In November 1992, Paul Heyman confronted Watts about critical comments Watts had made to The Torch, calling him a scatterbrain and nonconformist. When Heyman read Watts some of his racist quotes from the 1991 interview, Watts allegedly responded with ethnic slurs directed at Heyman. Heyman was fired and subsequently sued WCW for wrongful termination at Halloween, Havoc 1992. Dangerously publicly fired Medusa on screen using derogatory language. By Clash of the Champions 21 in late November, the Dangerous Alliance was officially disbanded as Heyman left for what would become Eastern Championship Wrestling. The future ECW, WCW had one of the greatest heel factions ever assembled, and they threw it away through mismanagement and personal conflicts. Think about the talent in that group. Paul Heyman would go on to create ECW and become arguably the greatest manager in wrestling history. Steve Austin would become the biggest star of the Attitude Era. Arn Anderson was one of the greatest workers and talkers of his generation. Rick Rude was a main event caliber performer who could have carried the world championship. Bobby Eaton was criminally underrated as both a singles and tag team wrestler. Even Larry Zbyszko brought veteran credibility and could work a crowd on the microphone. This faction should have dominated WCW for years. They should have had the world championship. They should have main evented Starrcade. They should have been the centerpiece of the company's programming throughout 1992 and into 1993. Instead, they were broken up within months of their greatest triumph because management couldn't get out of their own way. The War Games match proved what the dangerous alliance could deliver when given the opportunity. 5 stars from Dave Meltzer. Universal acclaim from fans and critics. A match that still holds up over 30 years later as one of the greatest in wrestling history. And WCW's response was to let the angle fall apart through incompetent booking and personal conflicts between Watts and Heyman. Paul Heyman leaving for ECW was one of the worst losses in WCW history. He would transform that tiny Philadelphia promotion into a cultural phenomenon that changed professional wrestling forever. WCW could have had that creative vision working for them. Instead, they fired him over personal animosity. On August 2, 1992, in Baltimore, Maryland, Ron Simmons became the first recognized Black World Heavyweight Champion in a major wrestling promotion when he defeated Big Van Vader for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. The circumstances were unusual. Sting had been scheduled to face Vader for a rematch but was injured in storyline by Jake Roberts earlier in the evening. Bill Watts held a raffle to determine who would face Vader, and Simmons won the drawing. Simmons learned he was winning the championship that same day. As he recalled in WWE Untold, he came waltzing in just as he normally did. He got told by Bill Watts that he was going to be up for the World Championship tonight. Simmons couldn't believe it. Tonight? Him? How? Why? Watts' response was simple. Why not you? Tonight we're going to make history here. Despite his racist comments, which would later become public, Watts had a genuine track record of elevating black wrestlers. Jim Ross confirmed this. The one thing about Cowboy was that he didn't have any issues elevating African Americans. He had an African American booker in Ernie Ladd. He had an African American top babyface in Junkyard Dog. So Ron becoming the champion under Cowboy's tutelage didn't surprise Ross whatsoever. The problem was everything that happened after the title win. Simmons held the championship for 150 days, but his reign is remembered as a massive missed opportunity due to consistently poor booking. He didn't main event pay-per-views. At Halloween Havoc, 1992, Simmons defeated the Barbarian in the mid-card, while Sting vs. Jake Roberts main evented. He faced weak opponents. The Barbarian at Halloween Havoc. Dr. Death Steve Williams replacing the injured Rick Rude at Starrcade. He never got quality feuds with major stars. Injuries disrupted planned feuds. Cactus Jack got injured. Butch Reed was fired for missing a flight. Rick Rude got hurt before Starrcade. Simmons was treated as secondary to Sting throughout his reign. Jake Roberts went after Sting, not the champion. Simmons was saddled with lesser opponents, while Sting got the marquee names. He won and lost the title at house shows, not on pay-per-view. This reduced the significance of both title changes. Vader regained the belt on December 30th, 1992. Ironically, it happened in Baltimore, the same city where Simmons had won it. Jim Ross was candid about the failure on grilling JR. He said Simmons' booking was half-assed. It wasn't fully committed. In reality, Ron was not booked well, and Ross thinks race had something to do with that. Ron was not a polished, seasoned worker, but you could work around that. That's why you have great heels. Ross doesn't think Simmons had a fair shake, and he doesn't know that anybody in upper management fought for him. The contrast with how WCW would later book Goldberg's undefeated streak makes Simmons' treatment even more frustrating. When WCW finally figured out how to build a champion, they knew exactly what to do. Strong opponents, dominant victories, pay-per-view main events, protected finishes. None of that was given to Simmons. Ron Simmons deserved better. He was a legitimate athlete who had been an All-American nose guard at Florida State. He had the look of a champion. He had the credibility. He had the crowd support when he won the title. The Baltimore crowd erupted when he pinned Vader. It was a genuinely historic moment that meant something to fans. But WCW treated his reign as a placeholder until they could get the belt back on Vader or transition to their next plan. Simmons wasn't given marquee feuds because management didn't invest in building them. He wasn't given pay-per-view main events because Sting was always positioned above him. He wasn't given time to develop as champion because the company was in constant chaos. WCW made history by crowning Ron Simmons as champion. Then, they completely failed to capitalize on it. The first black world champion in major wrestling history deserved a reign that meant something. Instead, he got 5 months of mediocre booking before losing the title at a house show. No controversy better illustrated WCW's dysfunction under Bill Watts than the push given to his son Eric Watts. Eric was a former Louisville Cardinals quarterback who had trained at the power plant for approximately 3 months. He was put on television against the explicit advice of the trainers who said he wasn't ready. Eric debuted at a house show on August 27, 1992. His first televised appearance came on October 17, 1992, on WCW Worldwide. Despite his inexperience, he went on an undefeated streak for 3 months. He defeated established wrestlers including Scotty Flamingo, who later became Raven, Vinny Vegas, who became Kevin Nash, and Diamond Dallas Page. On November 25, 1992, he upset veteran Bobby Eaton by submission. In December, he went to multiple time-limit draws with U.S. champion Rick Rude. The locker room was furious. Arn Anderson explained on the ARN show that if you have the ability to give your son a push, why would you do it in the face of making it so lopsided that you turned the audience on Eric? Wrestling fans are like any other sports fans. They want you to earn your way to a championship. They don't want it handed to you. Anderson added that nobody was going to blame Eric. Nobody blamed Eric. They knew it was a bad situation to be in. The blame fell entirely on Bill Watts for the booking decisions. Steve Austin reportedly refused a job to Eric. He told management flatly that he wasn't doing it. This was considered an extremely risky move for a wrestler's career, but Austin recognized how damaging the match would be to his credibility. The absolute nadir came at Starrcade 1992 during the lethal lottery match pairing Eric with Jushin Thunder Liger against Sting and Steve Williams. The match is legendary for featuring what wrestling historians call the worst dropkick in history. Eric slugged away and unleashed the historic worst dropkick in history. He flopped on the ground like a fish in the process. Jim Ross noted that he didn't get all of it in an understatement for the ages. Eric barely got off the ground. He mistimed the move entirely. He hit Williams somewhere around the thigh. The crowd popped huge when Williams hit a stun gun and easily pinned Eric. The fans booed Eric at every show. The other wrestlers resented him as they were fighting for their jobs while Eric's career was handed to him. Eric's career was majorly damaged before it really began and never recovered. Most gallingly, Pro Wrestling Illustrated ironically named Eric Rookie of the Year in 1992. This was widely seen as the wrestling magazine sucking up to WCW despite zero fan support for the pick. WCW's October pay-per-view introduced the Spin the Wheel. Make the deal concept for the Sting vs. Jake Roberts main event. A wheel containing various match stipulations would be spun to determine the match type. The options included barbed wire, cage match, dog collar, first blood, I quit, lumberjacks with belts, Texas death match, and others. The company spent money producing a mini-movie to promote the concept. The problem was that according to reports, the wheel was not rigged. This made it one of the only genuinely random elements in professional wrestling. When Sting spun the wheel, it landed on coal miner's glove match. This was essentially a gimmick on a pole stipulation where the winner had to retrieve a metal-covered glove and use it as a weapon. Eric Bischoff later reflected on the 83 Weeks podcast. He said the spin the wheel. Make the deal thing was a Dusty Rhodes idea. He gets the idea and there's intrigue, but he remembered even in 1992 thinking that this was just about as corny and about as bad as it gets. After months of build-up, the main event was a dull match ending with Sting hitting Roberts with the glove. This was Jake Roberts' only WCW pay-per-view appearance. He checked himself into rehab soon after. Reviews consistently note that while the first half of the show delivered quality wrestling, the main event was a massive letdown. The undercard also suffered from chaos. Terry Gordy no-showed the event entirely, forcing Steve Austin to substitute in the tag title match. Rick Steiner was injured during a Japanese tour with a torn chest muscle. And Nikita Koloff's career effectively ended when Vader's stiff clothesline caused a herniated disc. WCW's flagship pay-per-view on December 28th. 1992 at the Omni in Atlanta returned to the widely criticized Battle Bowl format for the second consecutive year. The Lethal Lottery randomly paired tag teams to compete with winners advancing to a battle royal. The winner received a commemorative ring. The show suffered from fundamental structural problems. There were no real stakes. Wrestlers were fighting for a worthless ring that doesn't give you anything. The focus was confusing. Sting was presented his 1991 Battle Bowl ring as the highest honor. Then there were 2 world title matches. Then the King of Cable finals. Then the Battle Bowl main event. Random pairings created no chemistry between partners. Tag matches didn't develop angles or advance storylines. Wrestlers were fatigued. Sting and Vader wrestled 3 times in one night. A Battle Royal main evented Starrcade again. This felt anticlimactic for WCW's biggest show of the year. Adding injury to insult, Rick Rude was hurt with a herniated disc and couldn't face Simmons as planned. Steve Austin, Arn Anderson, and Bobby Eaton weren't booked at all. The show had Bill Watts' characteristic, stripped-down barebones look with gloomier lighting. The Battle Bowl winner, the Great Muta, had literally just appeared in WCW after a 6-month absence. Most absurdly, Vader would win the world title 2 days later at a house show. This made Simmons' Starrcade defense completely pointless in retrospect. Critics gave the show terrible reviews. The verdict was that Bill Watts got fired almost immediately following this show. Both world title matches were dull and disappointing. A Battle Royal main evented Starrcade again. The Battle Bowl format was universally despised. The buy rate reflected the audience's disinterest. Only 95,000 buys. This was down 70,000 from Halloween Havoc. The Omni drew only 8,000 fans for the show, despite a capacity of over 16,000. For context, Starrcade was supposed to be WCW's WrestleMania, their biggest show of the year. Their flagship event that dated back to 1983. And they drew fewer than 100,000 pay-per-view buys with a format that fans hated. The Lethal Lottery concept fundamentally misunderstood what fans wanted from a major wrestling event. Fans want to see feuds blow off. They want to see stories reach their climax. They want championship matches that mean something. They want to know that the main event matters. Instead, WCW gave them random tag team pairings with no storyline significance. They gave them a battle royal where the prize was a ring. They gave them a format that prevented any real drama or storytelling. The whole concept felt like filler stretched across a 3-hour pay-per-view. Starrcade 1991 had used the same Battle Bowl format and fans hated it then too. The logical response would have been to try something different in 1992. Instead, WCW doubled down on a failed concept and delivered an even worse show. This was symptomatic of the company's larger problems. They refused to learn from their mistakes. Bill Watts' management style drove away some of WCW's most valuable performers. Most damaging was the departure of the Steiner brothers in November 1992. Watts wanted to sign Rick and Scott to new long-term deals but demanded pay cuts from both. Rick Steiner was insulted by the offer and walked away. Watts also attempted to break up the tag team, planning a Scott-Steiner heel turn that Scott refused. This led to a behind-the-scenes shouting match between Scott and the executive. Jim Ross explained on Grilling JR that Bill's lack of ability or motivation to make peace with Scott was unsuccessful. Bill told Rick that he wasn't going to sign his brother back. Watts expected Rick to take his side against his own brother. Rick didn't. Scott had just won the WCW Television Championship on October 17, 1992. He was forced to vacate it upon departure. Both brothers signed with WWE and debuted on December 21, 1992. They went on to win the WWE Tag Team Championship in 1993. Watts' contract negotiations with other wrestlers were equally toxic. The day before Jake Roberts' WCW debut, Watts called him in and literally tore up his contract in front of him. Then he forced Roberts to sign a lesser deal. Watts pressured Brian Pillman to give up his lucrative guaranteed contract in exchange for a major push. Pillman refused. He reportedly said he was happy to be the most highly paid opening match loser in the business. Watts threatened to book him to lose repeatedly as punishment. Terry Gordy demanded more money after being brought in. Despite being a longtime Watts favorite from Mid-South, he was fired. Tully Blanchard was offered only $300 per night for a four-horseman reunion. Blanchard declined. Watts refused to give a bonus to Sting, who was WCW's hottest star. Only Sting's loyalty kept him from leaving. Watts also fractured the New Japan relationship that Hurd and Frey had cultivated. His inability to meet asking prices meant WCW missed opportunities to sign talent, like Bret Hart, when his WWE contract was expiring. The ticking time bomb that would destroy Watts' WCW tenure was the interview he gave to Wade Keller of the Pro Wrestling Torch in 1991. The same interview credited with getting him hired. Published in the Torch Summer Annual, the interview contained statements that were shocking even by the standards of that era. Watts expressed support for business owners being able to discriminate. He made offensive statements about slavery and race relations. He praised former Georgia Governor Lester Maddox, who had famously refused to serve black customers at his restaurant. The interview also contained vicious homophobic comments. The controversy exploded in early February 1993. Mark Madden was a Torch columnist who worked at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. He saw Watts socializing with baseball legend Hank Aaron on a WCW live television special and was taken aback. Madden contacted Aaron, who had just spoken out against Cincinnati Reds owner Marge Schott's racism 2 weeks earlier. Aaron had no idea who Watts was or what he had said. Madden faxed him the interview. Aaron's reaction was that the statements were horrible and despicable. He said it was just terrible regardless of whether you work for a company or work for yourself. This is too big a company and it stands for too much to have something like this stand in the way. As Madden wrote in his February 15, 1993 Torch column, that was Tuesday and Wednesday, Bill Watts was gone. Watts departed WCW on February 10, 1993, just days before Super Brawl III. Whether he resigned or was forced out remains disputed. In a defensive letter to Aaron published in April 1993, Watts cited his Native American heritage and his record of hiring black wrestlers. He claimed the interview was taken out of context. Audio evidence shows it was not. Jake Roberts' assessment on the DDP Snake Pit podcast was unsparing. He said you should respect the man for what he can teach you about wrestling, but as far as a human being, he was ugly and a racist bully. Roberts said Watts disrespected Ernie Ladd and called him racial slurs, because Watts knew Ernie couldn't do anything about it because he needed the job. Jesse Ventura joined WCW as color commentator in February 1992 at Super Brawl II. His arrival followed a dispute with Vince McMahon over licensing and video royalties that led him to sue Titan Sports. Ventura won more than $750,000 despite having signed a contract waiving royalties. The court ruled his signature was obtained fraudulently. Ventura's WCW contract was worth close to $1 million over 2 years. This made him the highest-paid figure in wrestling at the time, according to Tony Schiavone. Jim Ross admitted he didn't like it when Jesse first arrived mainly out of jealousy for how much Ventura was being paid. Ventura worked alongside Schiavone and Ross on all pay-per-views and Clash of Champions specials. Schiavone later said he loved working with Jesse. Jesse and Schiavone were friends, and it will always be one of the highlights of his career. However, Ventura's WCW work didn't quite reach the same level of visibility as his WWE years. Ventura was eventually released by Eric Bischoff in July 1994. He was allegedly let go for falling asleep during a WCW worldwide television taping at Disney MGM Studios, though his departure conveniently coincided with Hulk Hogan's arrival. Beyond the management disasters, 1992 saw WCW continuing to push embarrassing gimmicks that reflected creative bankruptcy. Van Hammer exemplified the company's misplaced priorities. The heavy metal-themed wrestler was signed to a $156,000 deal and given a $20,000 entrance video. Despite being a mediocre wrestler given a heavy metal gimmick, he had the look and the push and the marketability to be a huge star. In fact, he only had one weakness: wrestling. Arachnoman was a Spider-Man ripoff performed by Brad Armstrong. The gimmick featured a blue and yellow webbed outfit so blatantly derivative that Marvel Comics threatened to sue WCW. The gimmick was quickly dropped. The aftermath of the Black Scorpion fiasco from 1990 still hung over the company. This angle was created by Ole Anderson with literally no plan for who was under the mask. It featured cheap magic tricks and a spaceship entrance at Starrcade. The anticlimactic reveal showed it was Ric Flair all along. Arn Anderson called it a popcorn fart and a failing proposition from the beginning. The outfit looked cheap. Just plain black tights and plain black top. It looked like something you could buy down at the grocery store. The debacle had helped poison Flair's relationship with management, contributing to his 1991 departure. Under Bill Watts' leadership from May 1992 to February 1993, every area of WCW's business declined. Beach Blast and Great American Bash both hit record-low buy rates. Starrcade drew only 8,000 fans at the Omni, which had a capacity of over 16,000. Dave Meltzer noted it was the third largest live gate for WCW in 1992, so it wasn't a total failure. But 8,000 paid for Starrcade at the Omni would hardly be considered a success for WCW's marquee event. Watts did succeed in cutting company losses from $1.6 million per year to $400,000 per year. But he achieved this through cost-cutting rather than revenue growth. He eliminated catering at television tapings. He removed coffee at house shows. He canceled workers' compensation insurance. He negotiated contracts that paid wrestlers less while withholding bonus portions that would be forfeited if they quit within 4 months. The contrast with WWE was stark. Despite its own struggles with the steroid scandal, WWE still drew significantly higher pay per view buy rates. Royal Rumble 1992 hit approximately 500,000 buys. SummerSlam 1992 drew around 600,000 homes for the Wembley Stadium show. Even their weakest shows outperformed WCW. In just over a year, WCW cycled through 4 different corporate leaders. Jim Herd was forced out in January 1992. Kip Frey lasted from January to May 1992. Bill Watts ran things from May 1992 to February 1993. Ole Anderson briefly took over before Eric Bischoff was promoted to Executive Vice President in February 1993. Eric Bischoff described Watts' tenure as one of the biggest train wrecks in the history of professional wrestling. Watts was only interested in taking the WCW product back to 1970s standards with poorly lit arenas and house shows in remote rural towns. Wrestling historian John Lister summarized it best. Trying to simply take the business of the 1980s territories and throw it into 1992 with no regard for how the industry had changed proved a failure. Bill Watts had the knowledge to run a successful wrestling territory, but his knowledge was outdated, his management style was toxic, and his personal views were reprehensible. The combination proved disastrous for WCW. The company would eventually recover under Eric Bischoff. Monday Nitro would launch in 1995. The New World Order would debut in 1996. WCW would win the Monday Night Wars for 83 consecutive weeks. But none of that success erases how badly they failed in 1992. Like and subscribe for more hard-hitting WCW documentaries. Until next time.